Roger, thank you for accepting our invitation for this interview here in CNN Brazil.
My pleasure, Victor. Great to be back.
Roger, I'd like to start this conversation by discussing the concept of disrupt. How would you define this concept that is so used so often in your books and gives name to this one?
So, like many things, we often have preconceived ideas and they might evolve, right? So I see three phases of disruption. Disruption, which I call disruption 1.0, which is in effect Joseph Schumpeter in institutional economic foundations, like in the 1950s in Europe, when it was rebuilding after the war, there was a process of creative destruction. There was destruction, very unfortunate, but somehow it built up cities, innovations, institutions, which went on from there, and there was some form of progress in that. And then I think most people, and I'm sure many or most of your listeners, will think about disruption from a maybe technocentric perspective, innovation, product, markets, the Silicon Valley label for disruption. And a lot of that thinking is from the genius of Clayton Christensen around disruptive innovation. But disruptive innovation, I think, was very relevant and important in times where you could isolate specific phenomena. And you could say, okay, for instance, in Clayton Christensen's world, Uber is disruptive because, Uber is not disruptive because you're targeting the same target market, the same customers, but maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's an app, but actually you're targeting exactly the same customers.
But with another strategy, no?
Well, that distinction, you're right, is like for Netflix, Clayton Christensen would say, well, actually, Netflix is disruptive innovation because you're targeting a different market and then you're taking over the legacy, the incumbent player, the legacy player is trying something new. But we think things have evolved since then because in that definition, you can define what's disruptive innovation or what isn't. And to your point, what is a strategy? But they're often specific, isolated, understandable, replicable ways. And I think now disruption is systemic. In other words, you can't isolate a specific aspect. It's not just a technology, innovation, or product. It's systemic and it interacts with one another, creates further cascades and changes into something else. And I think the fundamental shift of what we call disruption 3.0 is that disruption is now systemic and it's moving beyond specific isolated phenomena, whether it's an innovation or product or anything else.
And when we talk about previsibility, I would like to understand how companies are prepared for the worst case scenarios. For example, I remember the pandemics. It was perceivable we would have such an event with so deep impacts in our society and, of course, our economy.
Yeah, so the different levels of thinking about prediction and predictability, right? I think the most fundamental is when the world is stable, linear, controllable, understandable, then I think you can apply the normal distinction between risk and uncertainty. So risk is, what is the variables, the probabilities. Uncertainty, the possible outcomes, you might not know the probabilities. Will there be a recession in the next 5 years? Will China become the first economy? Now, the challenge, I think, with predictability for companies, for economies, for everything, is when you move beyond uncertainty to deep uncertainty. And in deep uncertainty, you don't know the potential futures, you don't know the probabilities, you can't put a hierarchy, you don't know necessarily how to mitigate them, and you don't know how they might interact. And so that's what creates the systemic change and the inability to predict. So that is very different from uncertainty because there what happens is that they're knock-on effects. So an invasion of a country then creates food insecurity, then creates economic impact, power or energy security, social displacement, etc., or even a pandemic. So the challenge, I think, for companies is to realize that if they just think of uncertainty and try to predict the unpredictable, like predict and act, then they're making a bet on a specific strategy or outcome. And they're not thinking about other scenarios which might materialize in deep uncertainty. And so I think the challenge for companies is not so much to, or even economies like the central banks with inflation, not so much to seek to have a predict and then act model based on one assumption to the exclusion of everything else, but to understand how do you build in and accept that we're in systemic disruption, that there's deep uncertainty, that it is unpredictable, and then how do you nonetheless make decisions and move forward with the possibility of many outcomes you can't necessarily articulate or define?
Roger, in a timeline, do you think we are living right now a scenario that we live in this deep and I don't know how to put it, but a scenario that this imprevisibility is too high, it's freezing, for example, the companies to do some movements or building strategies, I don't know.
So it's a really good question, Victor, because it comes down to like decision paralysis, right? Is there so many possibilities or so many moving parts that we're just unable or unwilling to make those decisions? And I think we are definitely in what we call systemic disruption in our work, and we are definitely in that deep uncertainty. I actually think that organizations, individuals, and economies can build a new operating system, a new way of making sense and making decisions in that world. But it can't be the same business as usual. So let me give you a simple example. Take the interest rates and the central banks. The world and the central banks and Yellen and etc. didn't recognize that you were no longer in this sort of simple, isolated world, that it was systemic. So they predicted interest rates and they got it completely wrong. And we had the highest inflation for 50 years and they thought they could control it, but they couldn't. Now, there's nothing wrong with running the supercomputers. They have very good supercomputers, econometricians, statisticians, etc. The problem is when they assume the outcome of what the machine says to the exclusion of everything else, ignoring the interconnected knock-on systemic effect of change. So what does it mean? It means, for instance, very interestingly, Cleveland, as a central bank, decided on their own that they would stop recently making that assumption and relying on one specific outlook, but develop a broader sense of scenarios and possibilities so that if they get it wrong, because it's unpredictable, you will get it wrong. Basically, you have other flexibility, adaptive, anticipatory, and other ways of dealing with different outcomes, and you're not relying on that thing. So I think those companies that do not realize that different environment continue to sort of predict and act and make a bet on one specific outcome, they're either going to have decision paralysis or make the wrong bets, which will be very expensive in an asymmetric world, nonlinear world. Those companies that understand that unpredictability is there, maybe it's not a problem per se, but you certainly need to behave differently in terms of decision making.
Roger, you were talking about central banks' decisions of interest rates. We see, for example, the central bankers using lots of data and lots of information. Yeah. How can AI be used by, for example, the central bankers or, of course, big companies to make these decisions, making these worst case scenarios again, the unpredictable, predictable, or actually maybe mitigate the effects of the things that are not we are not capable to predict.
Yeah, no, that's the crux, right? How is data helpful and how? And then what are the alternatives if it's not, right? So I think data, AI can be very helpful for things that are stable, linear, predictable. If you have known unknowns, it's a linear world. If there's an answer to the questions, you can rely on experts, you can have pattern recognition, and that's great. And that's why AI is so good with drug discovery. That's why AI is helpful with some predictive markets on some specific narrow questions, like, you know, what will happen to the economy. I think the challenge, coming back to the fundamentals of systemic disruption and deep uncertainty, is that if you are really an unknown, non-linear asymmetric environments, which are simply unpredictable.
For example?
There's no data on the future. So for example, and the examples I'll give, don't take them as individual because they interact. Climate. Will there be singularity, superintelligence, artificial general intelligence? Will you live and work in space? Will longevity be 150 years or 200 years? What is going to happen with the dynamics geopolitically, geoeconomically, geotechnology? How will all these things interact? Biotech developments, other AI developments, that implicates the future of work. Climate impacts the future of human migration, including in any country, São Paulo, New York, or city. So when you think about those, which is the deep uncertainty, the challenge is, number one, you can't look at them in an isolated way because they interact. And number two, they're simply unknowable. And the environment we're in, you might think you're making a decision that is more specific or more isolated, but you're going to be affected by this broader environment. And so here, to answer your question, I think you got to acknowledge in those deeply unpredictable environments, AI is not going to give you an answer because AI might give you an answer, but it's not able to better predict the unpredictable because there's no data on the future. So you need to use AI where it's good, which is maybe for real-time evaluation to inform possible future outcomes, but not to predict.
Okay.
So you see the difference is, am I using AI for descriptive analytics, for predictive perspectives that might inform future scenarios, or am I using AI for predictive capabilities and prescriptive decision-making? And so I think insofar as you're delegating decision-making to AI to predict the future, that is where you have a problem for the unpredictable because there's no data on the future. If you're using it as a feedback loop, as an adaptive feedback loop to inform future perspectives, then that can be helpful.